Just how powerful are our words in the real world? Find out when we explore the power of spoken word and poetry. Up next on Black History Year.
Where'd you get those shoes? Easy. They're from DSW. Because DSW has the exact right shoes for whatever you're into right now. You know, like the sneakers that make office hours feel like happy hour. The boots that turn grocery aisles into runways. And all the styles that show off the many sides of you, from daydreamer to multitasker and everything in between. Because you do it all in really great shoes. Find a shoe for every you at your DSW store or dsw.com.
As poet Audre Lorde once wrote, poetry is not a luxury. It's where we name the unnamed, uncover buried truths, and reimagine the world and our place in it. The white fathers told us, "I think, therefore I am," Audre Lorde once wrote. And the black mothers in each of us, the poet, whispers in our dreams, "I feel, therefore I can be free." I'm Len from Push Black, and you're listening to Black History Year. For the Black community, poetry is more than art. It's survival and healing, a way to preserve our stories and resist oppression, to dream of better futures and then manifest them. But I wonder, even though poetry surrounds us, have we become disconnected from it? And if so, what have we lost in that distance? How can we bridge the gap to better enrich ourselves and our communities? How can we reconnect with the poet within who whispers, "I can be free"? Today's guest has spent her career answering these questions. Yolanda is a Philly-born poet, musician, curator, and educator whose work blends poetry, song, and community activism. A former poet laureate of both Philadelphia and Montgomery County, she's the author of Monk Eats an Afro and founder of the School of Guerrilla Poetics. Through projects like Love Jawns, a Mixtape, and Stellar Masses, Yolanda is out here inspiring and mobilizing communities. So get ready as our host Darren and myself dig deep into why poetry matters. Because it isn't just something we create, it's something we live. But before we jump into that rich conversation, here's some history to ground us in poetry's transformative role in Black culture. Tupac Shakur was on the rise in the early 1990s. He was Pac, the respected rapper, self-proclaimed thug, and actor, and he spoke his mind in every setting. However, there was one particular moment where speaking his mind landed Pac in a heated argument with another man on the film set of Poetic Justice, and it led to a truly unforgettable moment. As he cursed and yelled, a warm voice broke through the haze. "Let me speak to you." Maya Angelou's arm rested gently on his shoulder. Angelou, who made a cameo in the film, was on set that day and witnessed Pac's rage and helped guide him back to peace through her words. "Do you know how much you are needed? Do you know what you mean to us? Do you know that hundreds of years of struggle have been for you? Please, baby, take a minute," she said before finally sharing. "When was the last time anyone told you how important you are? Did you know our people stood on auction blocks, were sold, bought, then sold again? Do you know they did this so that you could stay alive today?" Those words of understanding and empathy from Maya Angelou made Tupac Shakur weep. The rest of the time on set gave him a therapeutic outlet. He took that single moment of empathy and channeled it into his films and his music going forward. What Maya Angelou did in that moment is something we all take for granted. She shared a moment of understanding and love with someone who clearly needed it. Sharing moments like that with those around us builds a strong community that passes those lessons on for generations to come.
Hey, how's it going, Yolanda?
Hey, how are you?
I'm good. I'm just peachy today. I'm flying with my wing partner today. Len, want to say what's up to the people?
Hey, what's up? How are you doing? How you doing, Yolanda?
Hey, Lance, good to see you.
Amen.
Yes. So first up, we're going to start with our true or false segment, Yolanda, before we dive into the rich legacy of poetry. And I'm just going to read off some statements, some blatantly true, some blatantly false, some very incendiary, and some opinionated. And you just let us know however they land with you. How does that sound?
Oh, sounds good. I'll do my best.
All right, first up, Yolanda, true or false? The Bible is written in iambic pentameter.
False.
Relatedly, true or false, Yolanda? The book of Psalms can be considered a collection of love poems.
I think that's true.
Yes. True or false, Yolanda? The cadence of modern spoken word can actually be traced back to Muhammad Ali.
That's a very opinionated statement, but I'll say partially true. Yes.
Ooh, we got to follow up on that, most certainly.
Yes. Ooh, we got a bit of a stickler. Yolanda, true or false? The film Love Jawns might have done more harm than good to the spoken word scene.
Oh no, y'all ain't gonna get me on the Love Jones. I'm a Love Jones lover, so I'm gonna say nah. Nah, that's false.
All right. True or false, Yolanda? Gil Scott Heron's original title for Whitey on the Moon was Get Out of My Space.
Nah, that can't be right. Nah. False.
All right.
Oh my God, for the video podcast so the audience could see Yolanda's face with each one of these.
I knew I was in trouble with the face stuff.
True or false, Yolanda? Maya Angelou's screenplay, Georgia, was the first original script by a Black woman to be produced.
I'm not as familiar with that, but knowing a little bit about Maya Angelou, I'm gonna say she had a lot of firsts. That sounds about right. I'm gonna say true on that one.
Absolutely true. Shout out to Len for finding that rich detail for us. Last one, Yolanda. True or false? Poetry can help us imagine a liberated Black world.
That's definitely true. And y'all already knew that.
Well, we want to know why. Quick follow-up. Why is it poetry can help us visualize a liberated Black world, Yolanda?
Well, you got to go to somebody like June Jordan, who said that poetry is a political act simply because it involves telling the truth. And so when we start to tell the truth about who we are as a people, when this country tells the truth about how we've contributed to its founding, when we start to tell the truth about what we really need to be fully formed, whole human beings, I think we're headed to the path of liberation, and poetry is just one of the many tools we can use to get there.
Absolutely. Okay, absolutely want to follow up there. Just thinking through all the different kind of cultural and political dimensions of this particular medium. But first, we like to open up all of our conversations with a big overarching question. You just touched upon it. We like to know from our guest perspective, what does Black liberation mean to you?
Hmm. That's such a loaded question, and I feel like I might answer it differently given the day or the week or the year. But I think for me right now, Black liberation looks like Black people having the freedom to live holistically, joyfully, um, how they want to live in this country. Black people to have the freedom to decide in all of its facets what it means to be Black. Black people to have their basic needs met, and then to thrive on that foundation. Because I don't think you can have liberation without your basic needs being met. So we got to start there. But I also think we have to think about what we need spiritually. And that doesn't necessarily mean about religion. It means about what brings us um, awe, what brings us reverence, what brings us joy. I also feel like we need a connection to our ancestors. We need to have uh, explicit connections to our ancestors on the daily, um, whether that is calling their names or, holding the memory of them through the work that we're doing every day.
Mm.
Um, yeah, there's so much to being liberated. It's a personal and a collective journey, though.
Absolutely. Absolutely. One thing that came up for me in your rich response, Yolanda, is the importance of cultural memory. You mentioned uplifting our ancestors, by name. Also, referencing through just practice, through ritual. Right now, I'm thinking about the relationship between poetry and just cultural memory in general. With that said, I'm wondering about the griot tradition. I'm curious, from your perspective, Yolanda, how do you feel like the oral storytelling tradition, the tradition of African griots, kind of keeping the culture together, how do you think that influences poetry, or has it influenced poetry?
Yeah, I don't see any difference between the storytelling of griots and poetry. I
Mm,
think there's a big storytelling tradition in poetry, a big narrative tradition. Um, it's because when we tell stories, we want our stories to be colorful. We want our stories to be musical. We want our stories to have rhythm. Um, our stories need symbols and imagery to make them memorable.
mm,
Um, so I think we've always been poets. I think griot is just another word for poet, because poets aren't just keepers of language, we're keepers of culture, we're keepers of the story of the people. And at some point, the idea of poetry, like many things, became commercialized and separated from its purpose as a cultural tool, a cultural gatherer. But we still see it. We see it in every open mic. You can go to an open mic, you go to a poetry reading, you get to sit at the feet of somebody like a Lucille Clifton or a Sonia Sanchez, and you understand that this art form is bigger than just an art form. It's something that is really holding our people and our story, for us to use and to tap into whenever we need it.
mm, mm. Okay, got a bit of a curveball. I'm sorry, Lynn. I kind of want to go off script just a little bit. Um, One thing that came up while we were prepping for this rich conversation with Yolanda was internally, I ain't gonna say no names, but we have quite a few people here at Push Black who don't really resonate with the power of poetry,
Oh,
who dismiss poetry, as you know, is just like a hobbyist activity. um, what I want to ask, because I feel like it's really important to foreground this, um, why is, well, we kind of touched upon it in so many different ways, why poetry is so important, but why do you think so many folks dismiss it, delegitimize it?
mm.
Maybe in your experiences as an educator, folks who shy away from the term being a poet, where do you think that comes from?
I mean, it's sad. And yeah, I'm looking at all the people on your team that are feeling that way about poetry. I'm looking at y'all. But honestly, I don't always think it's their fault. I think it has a lot to do with the education of poetry and the ways that the ways we teach poetry. I taught
Mm,
English for over a decade in a high school setting. And so I encountered lots of kids who, like one kid even told me he was allergic to poetry. Um,
Hmm.
and, I think at some point, we beat the poem to death when we try to analyze it. We quiz we quiz and test children on poetry, which is totally possible the more you get engaged in the art form. Like I went to grad school, and there's definitely a practice and a craft that you have to learn. But I think what I wish is that early education around poetry focused on the musicality of
Mhm.
language and the imagery of language and the vibrancy of language, rather than trying to pin down a specific meaning for the poem. I
Mm,
think what I love about poetry is that there's so many different ways to interpret and read a poem.
mm,
There are multiple meanings at work. There are layers of meaning at work. Um, and there's not just one way of looking at the poem. And people who are uncomfortable with ambiguity will struggle with that aspect of poetry. And I think if you want to get more comfortable with ambiguity and that space in between, that the gray between the black and the white, you go to poetry. Poetry teaches you how to live in that space and how
mm,
rich that space is, that we don't know, that there isn't always a clear answer or a one answer for something or one way of looking at the world. Poetry teaches that. So, the poet Muriel Rukeyser said, in school we're taught how precious poetry is, how important it is to civilization, but we're
mm,
not taught how to use it. We're not
mm,
taught that, hey, maybe reading a poem every morning or sitting down to write in your journal could actually save your life, could put you in touch with your deepest self. We're not taught that teaching a poetry workshop with some young people could really liberate their voices and give somebody a space of solace where maybe they feel like they don't have a voice at home or in their community, but they can have a voice on that page. I think there's ways that, especially our Black poets, Sonia Sanchez, Jane Cortez, Nikki Giovanni, June Jordan, these were poets who were teachers, who were activists, Audre Lorde, they knew how important poetry was to opening up people's hearts and minds. And they were a threat. They were dangerous because of that knowledge and that power that they could have in community spaces.
ooh, ooh. There's so much I want to respond to here.
Well, I just am moved to ask you, Yolanda, when did you first meet poetry in that way? When did it open up for you?
Yeah, I started writing poetry as a young kid, maybe about 7 or 8. But I was a reader probably before then because my mother was a reader. And so, on my mother's bookshelves were all of those Black women poets that I listed, and novelists, Alice Walker, Toni Morrison. So that was kind of the stew that I grew up in. I remember an early copy of Dudley Randall's anthology, The Black Poets, which cost like $5 and like is a paperback that later I would buy many copies of just so I could give it away to students as an introduction to Black poetry. But yeah, my introduction to poetry was Black poetry. And then when, my teachers discovered that I had a talent for rhyming and putting poems together, they started introducing me to kind of a wider spectrum of poets, the Shakespeares and Phyllis Wheatley. Everybody used to give me Phyllis Wheatley books for Christmas because they're like, she's a Black girl poet. Give her some Phyllis Wheatley. Um, but yeah, it was for me, poetry was a way for me to express myself in a house of domestic violence, right?
Mm,
In a house of alcoholism. It was a way for me to have a voice on paper and to to survive some part of my inside self, the softness, the innocence of childhood to survive on the page.
Mm,
And then later, I started to realize that it was a way for me to get places. It could open doors for me to write poems. I wrote a poem that earned me a full scholarship to college in
wow.
high school. And that was just kind of eye opening. I didn't end up going to that college, but it was eye opening then. I was like, I wrote a poem and that opened that doorway for me. Um,
Wow.
yeah. So I knew the power of poetry on the page. I knew what it felt like to read the poems of Black women poets.
Hmm.
and to be empowered by that, to start to see myself reflected in that. And I became seduced by that. I wanted to also be on the other side of that. I wanted to be that person, who had written a book, who could speak across time and space in that way to another Black girl.
Mm,
That's cool. One of the things we talked about was that um, through the exploration of everybody's creative path, whether or not you land on being an artist, musician, or podcaster, even like a lot of people, their first touch with their creative side kind of started with poetry. And
Mm,
I wonder if you, in listening to you to speak, I wonder if that harkens back to the idea of the connection of poetry with truth and finding that
mm,
truth within yourself, and
mm.
then even um, acting as a fulcrum to find truth within the world in which you're living.
Yeah, I mean, poetry's low tech. It's low risk, as the poet Michael Shirelli used to say to me. You don't need a lot of materials to do it. Doesn't
Right.
require a lot of polish and varnish.
Mm-hmm.
It's just you in the black and white marbled notebook, or you in the diary that your mama gave you. Um, it's just you and yourself. It's a mirror.
mm, mm,
Um, and even when I teach poetry, I don't like to get into the iambic pentameters or the rhyme schemes or whatever. It's just about putting poem to paper.
mm,
And I don't like to gatekeep that either. I think that there's so many different ways that poetry lives in our world. There's, your professional poets who are out here counting their syllables and things like that. And then, poetry needs this amateur poetry scene. And I don't mean amateur in a negative way. I mean it just in the realm of somebody who is just newly approaching this craft and enjoying doing it. We need that space of people discovering, continuing to discover poetry, discover, oh wow, this is a doorway into myself or into a community of people that I can be attached to, I can learn from, I can grow with.
mm, absolutely. My goodness. One thing that comes up for me right now, just thinking about your experiences teaching poetry, and also what you lifted up earlier about poetry's almost meaning remaking capacity, how it allows us to kind of transform how we understand reality, how we understand ourselves. Reminds me of one of my favorite poets, Andre 3000.
Mm,
One of my favorite lines from him, he says, "Don't just tell it how it is, but tell it how it could be."
mm,
And that's one thing that really resonates with me when I think
mm,
about the political dimensions or power of poetry, but just the capaciousness of poetry in and of itself. With that said, got a bit of a philosophical question for you, Yolanda. I'm thinking right now about the line of demarcation between prose and poetry. You spoke about the gray area that poetry is able to kind of play within. With that said, I'm curious, when does prose become poetry? What are, for you, its essential features or characteristics?
mm. Okay, so we getting technical now.
Oh, okay.
um I mean, there's a lot about poetry that separates it from prose. And then there's definitely something called prose poems that
Mm,
then recomplicate the whole thing. And I love being in that space between poetry and prose, honestly. But for me, poetry is a lot about line break. When I think about poetry, I think about the line. I think about a phrase of poetry that occupies a certain space on a page, and that a line can be in poetry can be of a certain length, and that sometimes poets think of a line of poetry as a breath, and that because each of us breathe differently and we take in air differently, the length of our lines, the way our lines form on the page will be different. So, I think about a poem as a series of breaths, and that, all of the tools that you learn as a young person about crafting language on the page become your composer's toolbox as a poet. You have obviously the white space of the page, you have the letters and the lines, but you have indentations, you have tabs, you have capitalization, you have lowercase, you have italics. You have a lot of stuff that maybe you shouldn't all be trying to use at the same time, but you have a lot of things at your disposal to kind of make music on the page with the poem. Um, and I find that different than prose. I think there's some prose writers that think about that stuff, but I think that's less of a concern. The music or the visuals of how the words live on the page is less of a concern, perhaps, to the prose writer than it is to the poet.
Mm,
Um, and when I think about prose, I think about kind of a momentum towards or momentum of narrative that is
mm,
pushing us forward, as which is different than, say, a poem that could just kind of swirl around in the same place the whole time, right?
mhm,
um and yes, a poem can tell a story, but then I just feel like there's so many different ways that a poem language can embody emotion. We can find a way for language to embody emotion on the page, and because emotion is never the same every time it shows up, um, that leaves kind of an infinity of possibilities of what can happen on the page.
ooh, 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 an infinity of possibilities of what can happen on the page. I don't think we need to go any further, Lynn. That's the last word.
I
Thank you so
mean,
much,
I
brother.
mean, dog. I'm like, this is like the first podcast that like, I can see. She's talking in such, illustrative terms, man. I'm like, it's absolutely amazing. Which brings to me to my mind, Yolanda. Um, you mentioned about how there is poetry everywhere, and I'm wondering, has there been a moment that you can recall or a memorable moment where you walked into a space and were immediately inspired by just the poetry of that space in itself?
I mean, like every day, yes.
Oh,
But,
mm,
the first thing that came to mind was a poem that I wrote called Germantown Speaks. And Len, I'm a Germantown native, it's a section of Philadelphia. Um, Beautiful, vibrant neighborhood,
A
historic
poem in
neighborhood.
and to itself.
Just a
Amen.
poem. Every time I walk around Germantown, I have a poem kind of percolating. Um, but I wrote a poem called Germantown Speaks, and it's just a 4 block journey up Germantown Avenue, which is kind of the main artery in Germantown, an old indigenous trade path, but also just a main artery historically through the neighborhood. Used to be a trolley path as well. Now the 23 bus still rolls down there. But I took a 4 block walk up there, and as I was just walking up the block, I'm looking at not just the architecture of the space, but the street signs, for instance, the
mm,
business signs. There's a
mm,
poetry to that. And I think in any neighborhood, like if I walk down a block in Detroit or a block in Chicago or a block in Brooklyn, I'd have a similar experience that the texture of these street signs, the names of the streets, the names of the businesses. I'm thinking of Taimika's hair salon,
mm,
all the way live, the Nile, Ubuntu art, fine art. There's so many layers and languages at work. Black English, African, Cambodian. Anytime I'm walking down Philadelphia, I'm being, accosted in a pleasant way by all of the language and the texture around me. And for me, that is kind of a living poetry, just waiting, kind of fruit waiting for me to kind of pluck from the tree around me, into some kind of inspiration.
when we think about just the way in which we mobilize the word poetic to describe so many different lived experiences,
Mm,
it can feel a bit expansive, but I always kind of come back to it, especially like when I'm struck with an experience that just leaves me with a bit of awe. For
mm-hmm,
instance, so I referenced this with our wonderful producers. I'm a big basketball fan. There is a basketball player by the name of Zion Williamson. who, when I watch him, it really does feel like poetry in motion. For me, the way that he moves, it really reframes what a body of that size and that caliber could achieve. Um, I was telling the folks, it really is like watching an Escalade do ballet. It's just like gorgeous. With that said, I'm very much curious, Yolanda, what does the phrase poetry in motion mean to you? And relatedly, when folks describe an experience as poetic, how does that land with you? How do you make sense of that?
Hmm. I mean, I use it a lot, poetic. Um, I think poetry in motion, I probably use a little less.
Mhm.
I think a lot about when I think of poetry in motion, I actually think of a public art project where they put poetry on buses. Um, and on little placards on buses, and so the riders could enjoy poetry as they they um they rode. But I think if I was to unpack poetry in motion, mm, I don't know. It makes me think about silk. It makes me think about ribbons. It makes me think about a kind of movement, a kind of motion that um, almost feels like it's not real, that it's
Mhm.
somewhere between the human and the transcendent. Um, when I think about something that's poetic, I think people sometimes associate that with what we call, the sublime, or what brings awe, or what just feels viscerally, intuitively right.
Mm.
Um, and yeah, I feel like they're just, for me, words like that are indicative of just the space that poetry occupies as a form to explain the unexplainable, to explain what is sometimes between one emotion and another. Is an emotion we haven't given a name to yet, or hasn't been, diagnosed. Yeah, I think there's just a realm of poetry. The poetry for me holds that space for what can't be explained, can't be completely understood, perhaps doesn't have a precedent. We haven't seen it before. Um, yeah, I think those two words, those phrases, poetic and poetry in motion, are occupying some of that space.
When you feel a cold coming, shorten it with Zicam, the #1 cold shortening brand.
Oh no, not before the holidays.
Your cold is coming! Your cold is coming!
Thanks, Revere. I really should keep Zicam in the house.
Getting a cold is on no one's wish list.
Take it from America's most revered messenger. Shorten your cold at the first sign with cold shortening products from Zicam, the #1 cold shortening brand. Available in stores or see where to buy at Zicam.com.
This episode is brought to you by Google Gemini. With the Gemini app, you can talk live and have a real-time conversation with an AI assistant. It's great for all kinds of things, like if you want to practice for an upcoming interview, ask for advice on things to do in a new city, or brainstorm creative ideas. And by the way, this script was actually read by Gemini. Download the Gemini app for iOS and Android today. Must be 18 plus to use Gemini Live.
What's up, fam? Y'all feeling the episode so far? Look, at Push Black, we agree with Marcus Garvey when he said, a people without knowledge, their past history, origin, and culture is like a tree without roots. I'm guessing you probably feel like that's important too. I mean, you're listening to a podcast on Black history. So, if you're finding value in our episodes and are able to chip in, please consider donating at blackhistoryyear.com. Most people do $5 or $10 a month, but every contribution helps. Thanks for your support. All right, y'all. Let's get back to the episode.
Okay, I want to switch gears a bit. Want to touch upon two historical moments in which Black poetry seemed to kind of exists in a bit of a cauldron in the best ways possible. Right now, I'm thinking about the Harlem Renaissance and also the Black Arts Movement. But
Mm.
just thinking about the Harlem Renaissance, we really just want to rap with you and kind of gush with you about any particular figures you'd like to lift up because there's so many to kind of touch upon. Just want to shout out this title, "Fire," a quarterly devoted
Ugh,
to young Negro artists.
don't make me pull it off my bookshelf. I can't get to it right now, but yes, I know of
Yes,
it.
tell the folks about Fire who may be unaware of what that anthology was.
Oh, well, Fire, when you think about Fire, 1927, I think, we're talking about, the 1920s and Harlem. You got to think about a group of young Black poets who came together and said, we want to put together a literary publication featuring us,
Mm,
right? There's literary publications out there. They're not necessarily publishing young Black people in the ways that they want to show up in the world. So they're like, let's do it ourselves.
mm,
They only get one issue done because the issues get burned up in a building in New York, right? But they get one issue done and it lives forever, right? Like it's still, I taught it to my 10th and 11th graders when I was teaching English. We
mm,
used to get copies of it from the Schomburg sent to the
Mm-hmm.
school, and every kid would get a copy of this publication and be able to hold this artifact in their hand. Just think about that, from the 1920s, this publication that young people, like we keep thinking about, Zoriel Hurston, Langston Hughes, Wallace Thurman, they were young. They were just kind of babies in the scheme of things. Um, and they put together this incredible publication of poetry and prose, some of it really bold. Some of the first times we see Black queer people show up unapologetically in literature, unedited.
Mm-hmm.
um, so yeah, that's an incredibly important publication, and I think when I think about that, I think about what I since know. I'm a fan of the Harlem Renaissance. I grew up thinking I missed my time, like I should have been born in the Harlem Renaissance, with Zora and Langston. And what a time we would have had, at the rent parties and with Bessie Smith and all of that. Um, but what I've since learned through my own study is that the Harlem Renaissance wasn't just in Harlem, right? That
mm,
there were these literary renaissances, artistic renaissances happening all around the country in pockets of Black communities. And so
mm,
in Philly, we didn't have Fire, but we had the Black Opal Collective, which was a collective of young Black writers who put together their own literary publication, and they got more than one issue done. And you can find those in like the Bloxon collection, the Charles Bloxon collection at Temple University. There's still copies of them that you can see and see online. Um, but just a reminder of how these movements um, are not necessarily just rooted in one place,
mm.
and also how these movements were led by young people. um, I think that's the biggest lessons that I've taken from both the Harlem Renaissance and the Black Arts movement.
Ooh, absolutely, absolutely. Right now, I'm also thinking about the Negritude movement.
Yeah.
Um, and before we touch upon the Black Arts movement, and I feel like you've hinted at this earlier in our conversation. Right now, I'm just struck by, I don't want to call it the resort to poetry, but yeah, the resort to poetry as a means of expressing political ideals and how fascinating that is, as opposed to like choosing to write a manifesto or like a 10-point program.
I mean, this has been, I mean, you started with the griots, right? We already know what poetry can carry. We already know the power it holds. Um, you have to look at somebody like Phyllis Wheatley, or the poet Jupiter Hammond, how they were speaking truth to power when they weren't even free. Um, so when we're talking about Black folks who are about expanding what it means to be free and what it means to be liberated in other centuries, you have to kind of give credit to these folks who were about the business of abolition. Um, I'm thinking about the line, why make a poet Black and bid him sing? There is something very important about who we are as a people in poetry. right? Um, that our story is interwoven with poetry as a medium. Um, it's not just a little passing fancy. It's not just something that Phyllis Wheatley did as a hobby, right? This was really about staking our claim, finding a way for our voice to be part of the American fabric in a way that only we understood. And I think that extends to the way we think about hip hop and rap today is not separated from that, right? This is still how how we speak our truth as a people, right?
Mm.
How our culture has a voice is through this medium.
Ooh.
Um, so yeah, I think with the negritude movement, it just shows that yeah, it wasn't just happening in one part of the world. This is a global experience, a global movement. Um, this poetry and the diaspora have gone hand in hand, and in a lot of ways, poetry was a way for the diaspora to speak across oceans to itself. Right? You know, these poets they got around. Um, not just physically, but their words traveled.
Ooh. Ooh. Okay. Thank you so much. Right now, I'm thinking about the Black Arts Movement and what, at least from my perceive, with my limited knowledge base, what I perceive is a bit of a shift, I guess, in tone and tenor, and some of the poetry that's coming out of that particular movement. Were there like any kind of tonal differences in this poetry that was coming out of the Black Arts Movement versus the Harlem Renaissance? What I'm trying to
Oh yeah.
understand is, yeah, what
Mm.
was happening around the artists at that time, and how did it actually influence the rendering of those poems, of that artwork? How was it different than the poems of the Harlem Renaissance?
Well, you know, I think of poetry as always in both of these time periods that we're talking about, there's a continuum of poetry being written, right? There's a poetry of Black respectability politics that's being written by some poets. And then there's a poetry of, like, I don't care what they say and I have no F's to give being written by
Mhm.
other poets. And then there's poets all in between. And I think every poetic movement that we could talk about has people along that continuum. Um, and so it's hard to read, like, say, you know, we just keep getting more and more free, like, you know, somehow as if freedom is linear, you know, in that way. Is I think there are some people in the past who were more free than what we are right now,
Mm.
or decided to live that way, right? Outside of what, you know, segregation or federal laws prescribe for them. Um, so, you know, I don't always think about it that way. I think a lot of times of like individual poets and kind of how they are in conversation with poets from different ages.
Mm.
Um, you know, so when I think about like a poet like or a writer like Zora Hurston, you couldn't have you know, some of the Black arts poets without a Zora Hurston.
Mm.
Um, you couldn't have um, some of those Black arts poets that we admire, like the Amiri Barakas, without some of those Harlem Renaissance poets, or even some of those abolitionist poets. Um, the Harlem Renaissance is a misnomer because there were so many renaissances happening across the country at that time. The Black arts movement, I think, um, we could get a sense of it. You know, we had some different technology, we had some TV,
Mhm.
we could see um, how that movement was taking shape across the country. So there was a way in which, you know, the word traveled a little bit differently, right? And that we could hear about a poet on the West Coast if we lived on the East Coast and vice versa. Um, I think about the Black arts movement is kind of where in the space in which I grew up. My mother was a child of the Black arts movement. And so that was kind of my upbringing, is living in the wake of that, right?
Mm.
Living in the wake of the Black arts movement and what that meant. And in some ways, I think it cracked open a sense of language and what was possible for Black poetics
Mhm.
and what was not off limits. Like there was nothing off limits, right? Like you could just go there. In fact, I don't think the kind of discourse we have on social media today is possible without something like the Black arts movement, right?
Ooh.
Um, Like when we talk about the use of profanity, right, as artistic material, for me, that's an interesting hallmark of the Black arts movement that was influential to me. I'm thinking about like even some of the poems of Ursula Rucker on the Roots albums. Would that have been possible without, Amiri Baraka cussing up a storm, you know, or the way that the N word shows up in these poems, like the way that transformation of the N word in these. Are we allowed to cuss on here? I don't even know.
Yes, we are. Yes, we
Oh,
are.
okay. Well, the word nigga in some of these poems, how Sonia Sanchez, Nikki Giovanni, some of those poets later decided not to do that or changed their tune about that and chose other ways to express themselves. But there was a way in which Black people were saying, you know what, we're going to use language as a weapon and as armor and as a way to show people that we are not to be fucked with and that we are dangerous. And interesting, like how powerful that was, how threatened white people, white supremacy was by that, right? And how influential that was to other cultures, other people of color found ways to adopt that, and how that has maybe shifted the landscape of our protest culture, right? And the ways that we think about what can be said at a protest, what needs to be said, right? So yeah, I don't know. I'm not a historian. I'm a poet who has learned from poets in their lives. And to me, there was a sense of fearlessness that I think poets of this age, we admire that. And we also look to that to deal with our current day issues and struggles. That there are a few generations of us now who have been raised on that and understand how powerful it is to not mince words and just to say it plain, right? And I think about how powerful it was. The story for me of the Black arts movement, I really resonate with the story of Gwendolyn Brooks, who was, had won all the awards that you could expect to win as a Black person from white people in the white poetry world. Like she had checked off all the boxes, becoming an American poet. And then she saw what was going on with the Black arts movement, saw young Black people protesting, young Black people wearing their hair in afros, young Black people writing these poems about what it meant to be Black and proud. And she was like, you know what? I'm going to leave my white publisher and go be published by a Black publisher. I'm going to make my hair into a fro. I'm going to start writing poems about the Mecca that I came from. And that's just, I think that for me always kind of gives me a sense of what it must have felt to live during that time, to be swept up in the power of young people doing what they think they need to do. That kind of self-determination and utter pride in the face of people saying you're not worthy.
Ooh, ooh, ooh. Yes, yes to all this. Can I just like shout out like maybe 2 or 3 poems real quick before we jump to the next section? You lifted up Amiri Baraka. Amiri Baraka is probably like maybe my favorite poet of all time, one of my favorite artists of all time, for many of the reasons you just lifted up. So much of his language tends to just cut straight to the bone.
That's right.
And it felt like so I'm just thinking about his poem "Dope" right now.
That was the one I was thinking of.
See, I've been producers. Tell Yolanda if I'm lying. For the past like week and a half, I've been telling everybody on this team to go listen to "Dope" by Amiri Baraka.
That is all.
Wow,
Darren has been saying.
Must be the devil.
It's been. It's not even. It was. Yolanda, we have been planning this episode like since for the last 3-4 months, and every time we start to meet, like, all right, do we have the guests lined up? Have y'all listened to "Dope" yet?
Yeah, for real. Man, I'd have had the whole episode be on that.
It's
Yeah.
it's iconic, yo. I'm surprised. Like, I feel like, yeah, of course you wouldn't find that. Like, why isn't that taught in every high school in America? That's, but in my Black poetry brain, I'm like, this is on the classic list of just an amazing spoken word performance. Not to mention the poem itself, but also a performance. And Amiri Baraka doesn't stop. Like, that's just who he is. Like, he keeps making poems like that for the rest of his life. But dope, iconic.
The holidays are about spending time with your loved ones and creating magical memories that will last a lifetime. So whether it's family and friends you haven't seen in a while, or those who you see all the time, share holiday magic this season with an ice-cold Coca-Cola. Copyright 2024, The Coca-Cola Company.
'Twas the nights before Christmas. Despite last-minute stress, few were delivering except Walmart Express.
Stockings were hung by the fire with care, knowing in about an hour stuffers would soon be there.
On to the road, Walmart Express delivery went. Chock full of wondrous things in the St. Nick of time sent. Let's go!
Get express delivery in as fast as an hour, even on Christmas Eve. Orders must be placed by 4 p.m. local time on 12/24. Subject to availability. Fees and restrictions apply.
Express delivery to y'all and to all a good night. Welcome to your Walmart.
Okay, all right. To switch gears, I'm going to move on to our next segment. It's a word association segment. Yolanda, I'm going to read off some titles, some concepts, some words related to the legacy of poetry. And you just let us know whatever words associated with them come up in your mind. How does that sound?
All right, let's do it.
All right, first up, Crosswoman Blues.
Y'all messing with me. I'm gonna say Bessie Smith.
Louder Than a Bomb.
Poetry Festival.
Def Poetry Jam.
The first word that comes to mind, or just a word?
It could be a collection.
Speak your truth, Yolanda.
I'm gonna just say HBO.
Copy that. Copy that. Next up, choreo poem.
Intezake.
I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings.
Mama Maya.
Yes. Sonia Sanchez.
90.
Thank you. Okay, right now I'm thinking about how the spoken word tradition kind of lives on today in present day spaces. We talked about many different reasons why, poetry, whether written or spoken, may be delegitimized today in some folks' mind, in some circles. With that said, I'm curious, Yolanda, do you feel like there's a loss of public space for spoken word? Right now, I'm thinking about historical venues and cultural hubs that used to be almost like incubators for Black poetic creative voices. So the New Eurekan Poetry Cafe. We mentioned the Louder Than the Bomb Festival, HBO's Def Poetry Jam. But I'm also thinking about a series that you hosted, Stellar Masses, which was a series of poetry church services. Before we lament on the loss of public space and third spaces and whatnot, what can you share with us about Stellar Masses?
Yeah, Stellar Masses was a series of public performances that I started to envision in 2018 when I was thinking about the idea of poetry readings being like a form of church. And I felt like, I'm not a church going person, much to my mother's chagrin or upset. But for me, it's because I found art spaces to be more like church than church for me. And especially poetry readings have been spaces, open mics have been spaces where I've caught the spirit in some ways of I've really gotten a sense of, there's a deeper sense of humanity. And so I wanted to explore this notion of how could we create a church where poetry was kind of at the center of it. And so Stellar Masses was a series of these 3 church services and a party, which is also a form of church too, um, that, you know, invited poets to give sermons um, in their own kind of poetic ways, and then kind of complemented those sermons with a choir a curated choir and dance performances. So it's kind of a multidisciplinary church with poetry at the center. Um, and I think that to me is different than the question that you're asking about, like the ways that poetry has been absent from public space or is maybe losing public space. Um, there are maybe not as many open mics in Philadelphia as there were when I first got here in 1999, where you could go any day of the week. There was an open mic happening, a good open mic, like where you're going to see you know, poets of all ilks and creeds out here
Wait,
just
hold
enjoying
on.
each other's company.
Hold on, Yolanda. 1999. So is this like the Soul Quarian era in Philly?
Oh yeah, this is like Jazzy Fat Nasties, Black Lilly, um, Jill Scott, Ursula Rucker, Rich Medina. I used to host a poetry reading in Old City called Panoramic Poetry, and it was like that was the place to be second and third Fridays of every month. And you would be there for 2-3 hours listening to like 12, 13 poets share 3 poems each. I mean, it was like a marathon reading every week. And people got their life there. And not everybody there was a professional poet. Some of those folks went on to be professional poets, recording artists, DJs, whatever. But a lot of people there were high school teachers, high school principals, social workers, bus drivers, sanitation workers. They just happened to write poetry. And that was like where they wanted to spend their Friday night. Um, Not to mention, like, it was a good dating scene too. Like, people were trying to hook up too, in the
Love
artistic
Jones.
scene, right? It
Yeah.
was a little Love Jones happening there too. So yeah, that was kind of an interesting renaissance to be a part of in Philadelphia. That had a lot to do with my love of poetry and why I came to Philly. Um,
Came to Philly
yeah,
from where?
from outside of Philly, right outside of Philly, the suburbs. I grew up right outside of Philly, in North Wales, PA, about 20 minutes outside of Philadelphia, which to me is very different than Philly, the city. It's a different experience. I know people call it Greater Philadelphia, but it's not greater, and it's not Philadelphia. So,
Not at all. Not at
in a
all.
lot of ways. So yeah, for me, Philly was like the big city next door. And when I finished college at Lafayette College in Easton, PA, there was definitely a choice to go to New York or Philly. And Philly was calling me because in my junior year of college, I had gotten a taste of the poetry scene in Philly. And I was like, this is awesome. This is where I want to be. And it was not just a poetry scene, it was a DJ scene, it was a hip hop scene, it was a dance scene, it was a visual artist scene. I mean, black artists were doing their thing in Philly, and have always been here. Um, so yeah, I feel like there are different public spaces. And you have to, when you talk about public space in Philly or any city, you got to talk about gentrification and how a lot of those public spaces are just not there anymore because they're not there. They were taken. They have been repurposed for other people and other culture, or other ideas of what culture is. And so we've had to find other ways to be public with poetry. And I think that's kind of what I'm interested in exploring. I moved from being a poetry host to being a curator. And a curator was not necessarily a word that I thought of when I first started putting poetry events and hosting events together. Um, but I think about now, a lot of the work that I do is working with, organizations, institutions in the city to uplift the work of artists in public spaces, and to think about poetry not just as an open mic form, but as a form of public art, as something that
Mm.
could be integrated into sculpture, into something that deserves large scale performance and deserves bigger budgets, um, and involves publications. So there's a lot that I think um, a lot that can evolve from, say, the open mic space as a public way to share poetry. There's so many ways that we can imagine poetry showing up in the public sphere.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. I got a quick follow up here. I'm curious about the virtual space. Do you feel like you, for all this trappings that social media absolutely has, do you feel like that may be a generative space to kind of maybe reclaim the public a little bit? You think it's viable, maybe? Or would there be like a loss of intimacy trying to cohere like readings in the virtual space versus the public space?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a benefit to the virtual space. There are people who, for whatever reason, can't or don't want to leave their house or can't leave the spaces that they're at, right? There's an accessibility benefit to having programming, arts programming online. Um, Not everybody's going to be able to get to the places that we are hosting these programs at. Um, but I also would say, I would go back to what I said earlier, is like, are we using poetry as a medium for telling the truth?
Mm.
And can that happen online
Yeah.
more so than
Right.
it happens in real life? And I feel like I'm always trying to get offline and have a real life experience. Like, there's definitely a benefit to being online and having your words be able to connect to people in like different time zones, and the
Mm.
word travels so fast. So yes, that's a benefit, and it's a great tool to promote the work. But I don't think it will ever replace the experience I've had many times over at being in a room with a bunch of other people listening to somebody read a poem,
Mm-hmm.
and to be
Mm-hmm.
moved by that, to feel people going or having a
Mm.
visceral response to the poem. I mean, one time I read a poem in a library, and an older gentleman said to me, "I think I just had an orgasm listening to that poem."
What?
And I was like, "Okay. I mean, if
You're
that's what
welcome.
you're exactly, you're welcome. My pleasure, or yours." Um, but and to me, that in some ways is a compliment, I think. And it was a sexy poem, to be sure. It wasn't like just a poem about, some random tree or something. It was really, it was a sexy poem. Um, but to be able to have that kind of experience and that kind of truth telling, like I can tell the truth, and then that allows you to tell the truth back. Like we
Mm.
can have that moment together in public. And sometimes the moments that I've had after sharing, a group of deeply personal poems that showcase my life and where I've been, the conversations that I've had after that poetry reading, when people come up to me and they say, "You know what, that poem meant something to me because X, Y, and Z," or
Mm-hmm.
"I had a similar experience to this," or "This is what it made me think of." Like, just the ways that it lets people loose in a way, and that we can have some of the most intimate conversations with strangers that I will
Mm-hmm.
never see ever again. Um, that makes me feel like I'm doing something magical every time I step up to read a poem.
Oh.
And I take it seriously. I take what I'm doing really seriously, standing up in front of people, sharing that craft.
Mm-hmm.
Um, because yeah, I do think there are people who exploit the celebrity of it, or can use it to manipulate people. Like, you just there to get some ass. Let me use these words. Let me get laid, But I also think that there are poets out here who are really taking seriously what it means to step up in front of a group of people and open up your mouth with breath and body and tell the truth.
Mm. Ooh, my goodness. So much richness in what you just shared with us, Yolanda. Specifically, I'm thinking about how poetry is able to open up a space,
Mm-hmm.
even just those who attend to kind of lean in and share their truths. Just the disarming sincerity that's able
Yeah.
to kind of be coherent in those spaces is absolutely worth lifting up. So thank you for sharing that.
Thank
Um,
you.
I got a bit of a curveball question before we get to our last section when we think about the future evolution
Okay.
of poetry, some more politically engaged ideas around poetry. This was something we were wrestling about internally, and this is something personally that is just kind of I. This has bothered me for so long. In all transparency, Yolanda, there was a time I very much loved being part of the spoken word scene, specifically in New Orleans. Loved it. And at some point during my tenure, I realized that there was a certain cadence that felt codified when it came to performing spoken word. And I was like, where the hell did this come from? I don't know. I ain't been outside recently, but I feel like it still somewhat exists today.
Mm.
I lift this up because some other folks, I ain't saying no names, folks here internally felt they were totally put off on spoken word because of this kind of codified
Mm.
cadence.
Mm-hmm.
What I want to know, um, just from your perspective, your experience, fam, where do you think that shit comes from? Like, like, why did poetry take on that sort of rhythm, the type of emphasis and weights that it did? Like, where did that come from? Why are we still beholden to that? If folks still are, any thoughts there?
So many thoughts. I mean, the stickler in me thinks it's a lack of artistry. And that's what I thought when I first heard it in 1999, 2000. Like, I was like, you know what? Everybody sound the same. We all starting to sound the same. And my solution to it was like, I need to get away from y'all so I can hear what I actually sound like.
Mm-hmm.
And, like Amiri Baraka has a whole essay, How You Sound. And
Mm,
it was a question of how do I sound, not how do the rest of the people sound and how can we all sound the same. I don't think that's the point, is for us to be all on the same cadence,
mm,
right? I think there's so many different cadences, but we never really, when I think about that, when I hear that cadence again and again, I hear almost somebody who's not listening to themselves. And I
ah,
find, I'm like, what are your own cadences, that maybe the cadence you were born with, the cadence you were raised with, the cadence of your breathing when you're sleeping, the cadence of your own walk can't be the same as Amiri Baraka's or Sonia Sanchez's, right? Like,
Right.
we all walk different. Mama Sonia like 4 feet tall, so um yeah, I feel like cadence is something very deeply personal and connected to the poet. And it's also something you can alter, right? Like, you can make a new cadence. So I think when I found that happening for myself early in my career, I took a step back and I was like, you know what? I don't want to sound like everybody else. I want to sound like me. And I didn't know how I sounded. I didn't yet know what I sounded like. And at some point when you're a young poet, you're trying to sound like everybody else because you're trying to find out how you sound. And that's a
Yeah.
good exercise, right?
Hmm.
Like, that's not to be judgmental about trying on, and imitation is part of the work sometimes.
Right.
um but I do think you have to labor against the cadence that you hear around you, because it can stifle your own individual voice. And then you just get caught up in a wave of things that just all sound the same. And I think the cadence too embodies the content. And the content might shift the way that you say and speak these things. I think what's maybe most disappointing is like how every poem of yours going to sound the same,
Right.
because
Right.
really let every poem be its own new investigation of
Hmm.
you in the subject matter. um So yeah, I think I'm actively about resisting the standard spoken word cadences that are out about in the moment, and also actively resisting the cadence that I had yesterday. Because I'm trying to push into new territory. I feel like it's like a jazz musician, you know. John Coltrane, he wasn't playing the same thing he wasn't playing it the same way. And I think there's a way in which we have to sometimes allow, and poetry already has this embedded in it. We have to allow for that improvisation. We have to allow for the things that happen on the spot. The disruptions of the pattern are as important as the pattern itself.
In thinking about that, do you think that you have to make sure that you are continuing to live outside of the poetry sphere, outside of that world? You're continuing to have those experiences that will then influence the improvisation
Oh
of your
yeah.
words and of your thoughts and of
You
your
better.
cadences.
You
Yeah.
better. Cause if you keep there's like, you could like cycle around the scene, and
Mm-hmm.
if the people in the scene are trying to grow, you're not gonna grow. And you
Right.
gotta grow. And how do you grow? You find new places, you have new experiences. You hear people speaking differently. Go to a
Right.
different country, you're gonna hear people speaking differently. You go to a different state, people just say things differently. They have different expressions.
Mm-hmm.
All of that should trouble the waters for you as a poet, or get you excited about language, or renew language for you. um yeah, you have to challenge that. And you have to, in some ways, for me, it has a lot about been kind of what is it that I need to do to lay the foundation for my own creative life.
Mm-hmm.
How do I have what do I need in order for me to be in my best creative space, for my gift to truly thrive and blossom, right? Because you're given it, but you have to nurture it, right? We all have gifts, but we have to nurture them. And for me, that finding new forms of inspiration, pushing myself into new spheres. That's why I'm so interdisciplinary. That's why I'm a musician. I like to paint, because every time I'm doing some of those other art forms, I'm learning something about the creative process that to me is translatable back to poetry, which is my main form, my main squeeze. And so, you know, by dabbling in those other spaces, I'm learning how to flex some other muscles around creativity, um, that don't necessarily come right to mind when I'm thinking about learning the craft of poetry, but they're definitely useful in that space.
Gift the remarkable with Marc Jacobs fragrances this holiday season. From the iconic Daisy and Perfect to the all-new Daisy Wild, Marc Jacobs perfume gift sets include everything she needs to feel special. From her favorite fragrance, plus the matching travel spray, holiday gifts don't get much more perfect than this. So if you're looking for a gift inspiration these holidays, gift the remarkable with Marc Jacobs.
The holidays are back at Starbucks, and there's so much to share. With classics like Caramel Brulee Latte, Peppermint Mocha, and Chestnut Praline Latte, we're celebrating everyone's flavor of festivity. Order yours in the app.
Right now, I'm thinking about the future of poetry as a medium. And you used this phrase earlier, I believe, like uncharted territory, specifically with respect to kind of developing new cadences, new performance styles for our work. What I want to ask Yolanda is, what do you see or what inspires you about the future of poetry? Anything intrigues you about its evolution right now? I don't know, some folks would push back on this, but I personally believe, poetry absolutely exists in our everyday lives in ways that we don't realize. I even think like IG captions functions as a way of everyday poetry. I'm also thinking about just the merging of mediums. So I'm thinking about Warshawn Shire's work on Lemonade for Beyonce and how that became like a whole choreo poem film. Um, yeah, anything intrigues you or excites you about the evolution of poetry?
Yeah, I will say I'll highlight two things. One is poetry and AI.
Ooh,
Ooh,
Um,
oh,
ooh,
ho, ho.
whoa.
I think we see y'all gave me all the answer I need, right? Like we don't even have that's a whole other episode actually for y'all. Um, there's a poet, Sasha Stiles, who I would encourage people to look up. She's Mongolian American artist who is really breaking ground in the space with poetry and AI. She's mentored a robot in poetry. She's doing public art installations with fashion design houses and cryptocurrency organizations. Um, and she's talking a lot about what does it mean for poets of color to be in this space, because we're not in this space, just like people of color aren't necessarily thick up in this AI space as much as they should be, perhaps.
Mhm.
um, so I'm really excited about what that could yield, for my own writing, some of the experiments that I'm doing with AI, that I hope will just open up new space for my own process. But I'm interested to see where that's going to go. I'm interested to see where Sasha's work is leading and the other people that she will influence in the process of doing that. Um, and I'm also excited about the fact that spoken word is now a Grammy category.
Yeah.
That's a new development that honestly I didn't think that um would happen. I mean, I used to watch the Grammys and I used to be like, why are they calling this Bill Clinton audiobook spoken word?
Right.
And I'd be like, that's not the real spoken word. And I would always just be like, watching, hoping that one day there'd be an actual poetry album on there, because I knew that they existed
Mhm.
since the Black Arts Movement. We've had poets like Nikki Giovanni, Baraka, Sonia Sanchez recording poetry in album form. None of them got a Grammy. Ursula Rucker out here recording album after album. Give her a retro Grammy.
Mhm.
So yeah, to be able, I think that's going to change the scene, and already is shifting poets to think about, okay, now they're seeing us. What kind of albums are we going to be creating? And I would love for that to get, as a member of the Recording Academy, I'd love for that to get past the point where we're just choosing people who we know, as the poets, and that we really start to listen to poets who are pushing that line of what it means to meld poetry and music together, not just have poetry just be sitting on top of some nice little instrumentals, but what does it really mean for poets to be collaborating with musicians and producers to make something we haven't heard before that wasn't already done in the 60s, you
Mm.
know?
Ooh, absolutely. It makes me think of I'm surprised we hadn't mentioned him earlier, but Sun Ra. Um, just the
Mm.
experimental ways he was able to kind of weave together his super experimental kind of soundscapes, but also with almost like I don't know, his poetry almost feels like an ancient text sometimes.
Yes,
Uh,
yes,
an
yeah,
old scroll you dug up somewhere.
yep.
Yep.
Uh,
I
but no,
like
that's
that.
that's so rich. Okay, last topic, then we're gonna get on up out of here. Want to think about the political sphere of poetry today, specifically poets who engage activism, who engage hot button political issues. With that said, just at a very high level, Yolanda, what topics do you witness poets mostly engaging today? Social justice issues, and what issues do you feel don't get enough attention?
I really respect these poets, Saul Williams, Asia Monet, who are speaking out against genocide, in Palestine. Um, I appreciate the local poets here in Philadelphia who are speaking out against the Sixers stadium in Chinatown, right?
Mhm.
So, on the global and the local, poets are doing that work. Poets are on those front lines, getting the word out in ways that the people can understand. Um, Poets allow us to have that global perspective and that local perspective. Um,
Do you think they have that impact?
it depends on what you describe impact. I think we've been trained sometimes by grant speak and corporations to think about impact having to be quantified in ways that don't capture what it really means to change somebody's life.
Mm-hmm.
And that could just happen in a poetry reading, or that could happen in a poetry workshop. That could happen by reading a social media post, right? Some of that can't be quantified. um, I think we're going to have to start talking about climate in
Mm.
ways that make it irresistible, like revolution. You know, um, there's a lot happening. Like I'm thinking about the poet Alexis Pauline Gumbs, who just wrote an amazing book about Audre Lorde, and she's talking about what it means to be a shoreline person, a person who's living on the shoreline in this time, a person whose homes have been destroyed by hurricanes time and time again. That's a reality for a lot of the people who are living in the world right now. And our reality of the landscape and our environment is changing rapidly. And I don't think that our leaders, national or world leaders, have the right language to appeal to people to understand what that's really going to mean for us and future generations.
Mhm.
So, yeah, I think I need poets to get hip to that, to start thinking about what will be lost um, around us in our natural environment with climate change, um, how that's going to affect the ways that you know we see ourselves in the lines of our states and countries get drawn.
Yes.
Um, yeah, that's heavy stuff that I think that we need to consider alongside the political and social upheaval that we're seeing.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Got a quick stickler, maybe a counter question. Um, this actually came up in discussing with the producers, specifically poets of certain backgrounds who engage political struggles that they don't immediately experience themselves. So we were thinking about the Beat generation, and the white hipsters who were embedded in Black culture, Black communities. I guess what we want to ask, Yolanda, do you feel one should have a certain proximity, certain closeness to conditions that they write about in order to have license to speak on it? So, like, do you need to share in that same experience in order to be able to kind of write about it? Does one need a certain cultural license to engage certain topics through their poems? Um, yeah, yeah, I'm kind of tap dancing around this notion of like cultural appropriation, but also, just white liberalism wanting to parachute down into like um, marginalized context and wanting to be a voice for certain folks.
Yeah, I'm wary of white people who find themselves in that position and find themselves in the position of feeling like they want to or have to speak from a cultural perspective that's not their own. And it always makes me wonder what cultural perspective they could be speaking from that they are not speaking from. Um, I just think that, yes, there's a lot of work to be done about bridging cultural divides, but I think that sometimes white people just need to talk to other white people. More enlightened. If you feel enlightened as a white person, go talk to some other white people and enlighten them. Go home to some unenlightened white people that you may have been familiar with and try to enlighten them, before you try to enlighten some supposedly unenlightened Black people. Um, because I think there's so much work that needs to be done in white spaces, in white communities, um, that don't feel necessarily the sense of liberation that Black people feel.
Mm.
And when they do, when they feel a sense of whatever foot is on their neck and the possibilities for liberation they could have, then I feel like there's some real coalition building that could happen. between people who are coming from different places. Because there are so many ways that we are more alike than we are different. But racism, white supremacy, somehow gets in the way of us really understanding that. Really gets in the way of understanding the economic oppressions and the political oppressions that we share and that we will all inevitably face. So yeah, I feel like there's just a lot of work there's always this sense that there is something wrong with us as Black people, that we need to be fixed by other people. And there's so much outside of us that needs to be reckoned with. There's so much about whiteness that needs to be reconstructed and undone, before we even start talking about, what Black people need to be doing.
That's a whole word. That's a whole word. About to get us up out of here with our last question, fam. Len, you have any quick things you want to lift up real quick?
Man, I'm just writing down all these bars that Yolanda is dropping, man. And look, dog, I'm set up for the
Not
social
the
media
bars.
drops. Like, yo, like, I know I'm going to edit where she says, "I'm weary of white people." Boom, full stop.
That's the title of the episode. Yes, yes. It's been so fun rapping with you, Yolanda. Thank you so much for taking out
My
time
pleasure.
with us today.
Thank you.
Our last question before we get on up out of here, we like to lift this up to all of our guests this particular season. We're asking everyone just to lift up one song to add to our joint playlist for Black liberation. With that said, very curious to know, Yolanda, what's one song that has to be on your soundtrack for the revolution?
This was so hard to think about, y'all. Like, I mean, there's so many songs. But you know what? The one that I landed on that I was like, I can't live without this song is by Sweet Honey and the Rock. No mirrors in my Nana's house. And, it's like there were no mirrors in my Nana's house. The beauty and everything was in her eyes. And I think I go back to our grandmothers are so important for the revolution. So many grandmothers have led the revolution. So many of the people that we look up to, who have done, fierce, powerful actions in favor of people's liberation, were grandmothers. And yeah, I think that's so important to remember in whatever revolutions we're a part of, to remember the loving messages that we have received from our grandmothers.
My God. Okay. Let me button up because I want to talk for another 10, 15 more minutes. Thank you so much, Yolanda. We deeply appreciate you sharing your knowledge base with us, all your wonderful expertise. Thank you for putting us on game.
It's my pleasure. Thank y'all for having me.
Yes, we got to have you back on, especially to think through AI and poetry. I did not know this was a thing. I'm glad that it excites you. I got to look into Sasha Styles. Got to look into her work. Yes, thank you,
Yolanda. Thank you. This again has been a pleasure. And if the audience didn't catch on it, me and Yolanda go way back to the old days of G-Town Radio. And I have to say, it has been, once again, I had forgotten how pleasurable it was to just have you in my earphones, like so intimately again. So
right back at you, my friend.
That was poet, musician, and educator Yolanda Wisher. You can catch up with her poetry and her music at yolandawisher.com. This season on Black History Year, we've highlighted the transformative power of Black arts and entertainment throughout history, exploring how artists, musicians, filmmakers, designers, DJs, and spoken word artists have reflected and driven change. We've unpacked the impact of Black creativity on cultural identity, resistance, and healing. And we're so grateful that we've gotten to do it with your support. But tell us what you think. Let us know in the comments of Push Black's Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube pages. Find us and tag us at We Are Push Black. And if you found this show valuable, Don't forget to share this episode on your social media as well. Well, until next season, be free. You're living in history.
At Push Black, we agree with Marcus Garvey when he said, a people without knowledge of their past history, origin, and culture is like a tree without roots. We believe telling empowering stories on Black life and history can build a more liberated Black future. Being here with us lets us know you probably feel that's important too. You matter. Your choice to be here matters. It lets us know that you value this work. And you make Push Black happen with your contributions at blackhistoryyear.com. Most people do $5 or $10 a month, but everything makes a difference. Thank you for supporting the work. Black History Year is a production of Push Black, the nation's largest nonprofit Black media company. Our team includes Brooke Brown, Amber Davis, Mina Davis, Kevin McFall, Gabby Roberts, and Leslie Taylor Grover. Producing the show, we have Cydney Smith and Len Webb, who also edits the show. Black History Year's executive producers are Lilly Workneh and Julian Walker. And I'm your host, Darren Wallace.